I want to stick with this issue. Now, the National Party, they've made themselves pretty clear, or very clear, I should say, on where they sit in regard to this piece of legislation, particularly the issue around gun control. Nationals leader David Littleproud has been in discussion with the coalition partners today, and he's on the line. Thanks for joining us. Look, I made it pretty clear, David, myself at the start of the show, about Susan Lee's comments this morning. I thought she was very impressive. I thought the way she laid out the Liberal Party's objections to the legislation very clearly. Are you as worried about this legislation as she is?
I am. In fact, the Labor Party and the government lost the National Party when they went after guns. But when we saw the hate speech legislation, that really was the icing on the cake. They couldn't get past first base with us, and then when they showed us second and third, there's no home run there. This is an overreach. This doesn't face up to the problem that this country has. It's not a gun problem. It's an extreme Islamic ideological problem that has been allowed to creep into this country, that this government is not prepared to face into, not prepared to look Australians in the eye and say that not just what happened on Bondi Beach, but what happened on the 8th of October 2023, when that imam spewed hate on the steps of the Sydney Opera House, celebrating the slaughter of innocent Israelis by an Islamic terrorist organisation, all the way through to what we saw in the streets, the burning of cars, and right through to the firebombing of a synagogue. If we cannot face up to ourselves and focus on that as what is the issue in this country of anti-Semitism and the rise of Islamic extremists in this country, then we as legislators have failed this country, and that is exactly what Anthony Albanese has done with what he's put forward.
Knowing you would have read through this bill. I mean, you would have seen, as Susan Lee's seen, that there's no mention of radical Islam in the piece of legislation itself. What does that tell you?
Well, this is another diversion tactic like guns. The Prime Minister won't accept culpability, like Chris Minns actually had the courage to do, and actually acknowledge culpability for his part and not acting swiftly and harsh enough from the 8th of October 2023 all the way through to what we saw in Bondi. And this Prime Minister doesn't want to face up to that culpability. He's looking for political diversions. But what makes this even more egregious by the Prime Minister is he's now trying to bring in a catch-all of the other ideological views that he has around other parts of hate speech, to broaden it and to change society even more, to make it harder for the average person to criticise government and to make reasonable statements. And one of the things that the Parliamentary Library, after we went and asked some questions yesterday, came back that if you were to go out and to suggest that you believe that we have too many Palestinian migrants coming to this country, or Sudanese migrants coming to this country, you could be found guilty under this legislation because you have vilified and hurt under a reasonable person's test someone of that ethnicity because of your statements, making just simple statements like that. And this is the overreach that Anthony Albanese has tried to build into this, to see the political opportunism, to be able to make political ground out of this. And he's angry. He's angry because he's angry with the Australian people for forcing him to a Royal Commission. So what he's done is revert to type. The puerile, petty university politics that he's played all his life, and now he's gone back and he's playing with legislation that has far-reaching implications, not just for gun ownership, but now what we're seeing in this hate speech that would impinge on free speech. And that is the frightening aspect of the Prime Minister, his actions, his government, and what they are trying to do in the event of us hopefully coming together as a country. He's divided us even further.
I said at the beginning of the program that I thought once he was heckled at that Bondi memorial service that he took a great hit to his ego. I think he was shocked. I think he thought the majority of Australians, and certainly some of the Jewish community, thought that he was a strong Prime Minister. Since then, he's shown himself to be very weak. You believe that his personal feelings have driven this piece of legislation that you're looking at right now?
Well, exactly. He's had his ego dented, and he's angry that he's been forced into a Royal Commission he didn't want to have, because it will unearth the culpability of the failings of his government since the 8th of October 2023 in Sydney and beyond, and across Australia. And so he's reverted to type, that puerile, petty university politics that is just about revenge. It's about opportunism, of actually seeing a circumstance and then trying to also not only repay the pain, but also take more of the ideological boundaries that they want to extend under his leadership. And that's just a reflection on him. He hasn't shown the courage of his conviction and faced into the problem that we have in this country, which is extreme Islamic ideology. And he's done nothing about it, despite the warning signs. And that's what Australians are so angry and frustrated about. That's why they wanted a Royal Commission. I'm from Western Queensland. I've only seen twice in my life fear in the people's eye that I represent. The first was 9/11, and the second was on the 15th of December, when they woke up and saw what happened on Bondi. Bondi is this iconic place in Australia to many people in Western Queensland. We'd only ever hoped to even see it one day. And for what happened there, for Australia to be attacked in the most egregious way, just created this fear, this anger, this frustration that they wanted leadership. They looked to somebody to lead them. And instead, the Prime Minister looked for political diversions on guns and anything else. And then when it came his moment of actually having a Royal Commission and then facing up to what needs to happen to stopping these imams and facing up to anti-Semitism in this country, he looked to politics again. Not to the courage of his own conviction and what's in the Australian people's minds and in their eyes and their hearts at the moment. They want this fixed. This is not the Australia that we grew up in. We're the custodians of this society, and we're the ones that will hand it over to the next generation. At the moment, we're going to hand over a broken one unless we've got the courage to look ourselves in the mirror and say we've got to fix anti-Semitism. It's as narrow and it's as simple as that. That's the cause of this, not guns, not anything else, and the extreme Islamic ideology that's been allowed to creep in to manifest this anti-Semitism across the streets of our capital cities.
You're the leader of one half of the coalition. The Australians quoted this afternoon, and I'm loath to say this, but unnamed senior Liberal Party members saying they are surprised that Susan Lee said today that on Monday next week, when Parliament resumes, that the coalition will have an alternative hate speech bill or hate speech amendments. Does that surprise you, or are you across that detail, and is that what's going to happen?
Well, no, that's a surprise to me, and from the conversations I've had in the leadership between the National and Liberal Party, there will be no alternate bill, the hate speech bill. All we will be doing is scrutinising. At this point, I would say that it's fairly likely that the coalition as a whole will come together and vote against the bill. So I was surprised, and I don't know whether there's some confusion about what was said in Susan Lee's press conference, but what she has said very clearly previously is that we would legislate much of the report, all the report I should say, of what the Special Envoy into Anti-Semitism put in her report back in June last year. Around a definition of anti-Semitism, around looking at our migration and particularly the screening of extremists and other parts, particularly looking at our education system and our arts sector, about how they have manifested anti-Semitism across our society as well. So I think there's some confusion about what Susan Lee said, but I'll let her address that. But from the National Party's perspective, there'll be no bill apart from the one in which the Labor Party will put. And from where I've been from the very start, they lost the National Party on guns from the very first moment that Anthony Albanese tried to use that as a diversion tactic. We don't have a gun problem in this country. We have an extreme Islamic ideology that needs to be wiped out of this country. That's the problem that we've got to face into, and that's the one the Prime Minister hasn't been prepared to do.
Well, you've got a big week in store next week. David Littleproud, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.